If you opened a map of Canada right now and started circling every bank, every brewery, every department store, every sugar refinery, every railroad, every newspaper, and every grain elevator that traces its origins back to a single family, you'd run out of ink before you ran out of circles. And here's what makes it strange. Almost every one of those families showed up in Canada within the same narrow window of time. We're talking roughly 1780 to 1880. 100 years, that's it. In a country that had existed as a colonial territory for over 2 centuries before that, the people who would end up owning practically everything arrived in what amounts to a historical blink. John Molson showed up from England with a small inheritance, and within 2 decades owned the most profitable brewery on the continent. Hugh Allen arrived from Scotland as a teenager and somehow ended up controlling the entire Atlantic shipping route between Canada and Britain. Timothy Eaton walked off a boat from Ireland with almost nothing and built a retail empire that would define Canadian commerce for over a century. George Stephen, another Scottish immigrant, went from being a draper's apprentice to financing the most expensive infrastructure project in Canadian history. These aren't rags to riches stories. Not really, because rags to riches implies luck, hard work, and a bit of timing. What happened in Canada during the 1800s was something else entirely. It was a system, a network, a web of government contracts, banking monopolies, land grants, and backroom deals that turned a handful of immigrants into the permanent aristocracy of an entire nation. And the wildest part? Canadians don't talk about it. Not in school, not in the news, not at dinner. These families are treated like furniture. They've always been there. Nobody asks how they got there. Until now. If you're the kind of person who actually wants to understand how power really works, not the version they taught you in school, hit subscribe. I cover stories like this every week, the ones that make you look at everything differently. Drop a comment below telling me which Canadian family you think has the most to answer for, and stick around, because what you're about to hear over the next 2 hours is going to fundamentally change how you think about this country. Let's start at the beginning, and by the beginning, I mean before any of these families existed in Canada at all. Section 1, The Land Before the Dynasties. To understand how a small group of families managed to capture an entire country's wealth, you first need to understand what Canada looked like before they showed up. In the late 1700s, Canada wasn't really Canada in any meaningful sense. It was a collection of territories controlled by the British Crown following the Treaty of Paris in 1763, which ended France's claim to most of North America. What you had was a vast, resource-rich landmass with a relatively small colonial population, mostly concentrated along the St. Lawrence River and in the maritime provinces. The population was tiny. We're talking maybe 70,000 to 90,000 people of European descent in all of what would become Canada by the 1760s. Compare that to the American colonies, which had over 2 million people at the same time. Canada was, in the eyes of the British Empire, a backwater, a frozen, underpopulated territory that was useful primarily for fur, fish, and timber. And that's exactly what made it ripe for the taking. See, when a country has a small population, limited infrastructure, and almost no domestic capital, the people who show up with even modest resources have an absurd advantage. They're not competing against established industries or entrenched old money. They're walking into a vacuum. And in a vacuum, whoever moves first wins. The British colonial administration in Canada operated on a system that was practically designed to create dynasties. The governor and his appointed council controlled land grants, trade licenses, military contracts, and government appointments. There was no real democracy, no competitive bidding, no transparency. If you knew the right people, you got the contract. If you got the contract, you got rich. If you got rich, you became one of the right people. And the cycle repeated. This system had a name. Historians call it the Family Compact in Upper Canada, which is modern-day Ontario, and the Chateau Clique in Lower Canada, which is modern-day Quebec. These were informal networks of government officials, military officers, Anglican clergymen, and merchants who controlled virtually every lever of power in the colony. The Family Compact wasn't a conspiracy in the shadowy, secretive sense. It was more brazen than that. Everyone knew who was in it. Everyone knew how it worked. The problem was that nobody outside the circle had any power to change it. If you weren't connected, you couldn't get land. If you couldn't get land, you couldn't farm. If you couldn't farm, you couldn't build wealth. If you couldn't build wealth, you couldn't become connected. It was a closed loop. And here's the thing that most Canadians never learn in school. The families that would become Canada's permanent elite didn't overthrow the Family Compact or the Chateau Clique. They replaced them, or more accurately, they became the next generation of the same system, just wearing different clothes. The old guard was made up of colonial administrators and military men. The new guard was made up of merchants, bankers, and industrialists. The mechanism of power didn't change. Only the people operating it did. This transition happened gradually over the first half of the 1800s. The rebellions of 1837, led by William Lyon Mackenzie in Upper Canada and Louis-Joseph Papineau in Lower Canada, were partly reactions against the Family Compact and Chateau Clique systems. But while the rebellions did lead to some democratic reforms, they didn't actually dismantle the power structure. They just opened the door for a new class of elites to walk through. And walk through they did. The men who would build Canada's great family fortunes understood something that the old colonial administrators didn't. Political power was important, but economic power was permanent. A governor could be recalled. A military commission could be revoked. But a brewery, a bank, a shipping line, a railroad, those were assets that couldn't be taken away by a letter from London. So while the politicians were busy fighting over constitutional reform and responsible government, the future dynasties were quietly buying up the real sources of power: land, infrastructure, distribution networks, financial institutions, the things that make an economy actually function. By the time Confederation happened in 1867, the game was already over. The families were in place, the wealth was concentrated, and the new nation of Canada was built, quite literally, on a foundation they controlled. But before we get to the individual families, there's one more piece of context that matters enormously. The institution that had controlled Canada's economy for 200 years before any of these families arrived. The original monopoly, the blueprint for everything that came after, the Hudson's Bay Company, founded in 1670 by royal charter from King Charles II. The Hudson's Bay Company was given exclusive trading rights over the entire Hudson Bay drainage basin. That area, called Rupert's Land, covered roughly 3.9 million square kilometers. That's about 40% of modern Canada. One company, controlled by a handful of British investors, was handed monopoly control over an area larger than India. For 2 centuries, the HBC operated as a quasi-governmental entity. It built trading posts, negotiated with indigenous nations, administered justice, and extracted resources, primarily furs, from an area spanning from the Arctic to the prairies. Its employees were the first Europeans many indigenous peoples encountered, and the company's trading relationships shaped indigenous economies and societies in ways that are still felt today. The HBC demonstrated, before any of the families we're going to discuss, that the Canadian economic model was fundamentally based on monopoly. One entity, one resource, one vast territory, no competition, total control. It was the proof of concept. And when the HBC's monopoly began to erode in the mid-1800s, The men who stepped into the resulting vacuum had learned the lesson. The way to wealth in Canada was through controlled markets, government favor, and the elimination of competition, not the creation of it. Now, who were these families? Where did they come from? And how did they pull it off? Let's start with the oldest and arguably the most important dynasty in Canadian history. Section 2. The Molson Dynasty. Beer was just the beginning. John Molson arrived in Montreal in 1782. He was 18 years old, an orphan from Lincolnshire, England, and he carried with him a modest inheritance from his recently deceased parents. The exact amount is debated by historians, but most estimates put it somewhere between 400 and 800 pounds sterling. That's not nothing, but it's not a fortune either. In today's money, you're looking at maybe 80,000 to 150,000. What Molson did with that money, though, was nothing short of extraordinary. And it reveals the first pattern we're going to see repeated over and over again with these families. He didn't just start a business. He started a business in a market with almost zero competition, in a colony desperate for exactly what he was selling, with government connections that ensured his success. Molson bought a small, struggling brewery on the banks of the St. Lawrence River in 1786. Beer was a staple in colonial Canada. The water wasn't safe to drink in most settlements. Tea and coffee were expensive imports. Rum was available but destructive. Beer was the everyday drink of the working population, soldiers, and merchants alike. And here's the key detail. There was essentially no established brewing industry in Montreal at the time. A few small operations existed, but nothing at any real scale. Molson wasn't disrupting an existing industry. He was filling a void, and he filled it fast. Within a decade, Molson's brewery was the most productive in all of British North America. He was supplying beer to the military garrison in Montreal, to taverns across Lower Canada, and eventually to markets in Upper Canada as well. The military contracts were particularly lucrative, and they didn't come from nowhere. Molson cultivated relationships with British military officers and colonial administrators from the very beginning. He understood that in a colonial economy, the government was the largest single customer, and getting government contracts was the fastest route to scale. The brewery wasn't just a beer factory, it was a cash machine. The margins on beer were enormous. The raw materials, barley and hops, were locally available and cheap. The demand was constant and growing, and there was nobody else producing at Molson's volume anywhere in the colony. But brewing was just phase one. And this is where the Molson story gets really interesting. By the early 1800s, John Molson had accumulated enough capital from beer to start diversifying, and the direction he chose tells you everything about how these families thought. He didn't invest in more breweries. He invested in infrastructure. In 1809, Molson built the Accommodation, the first steamship to operate on the St. Lawrence River. Think about what that means for a second. In 1809, steamships were cutting-edge technology. Robert Fulton had only launched his famous steamboat on the Hudson River 2 years earlier, in 1807. Molson was among the first people in North America to see the commercial potential of steam-powered river transport, and he acted on it immediately. The Accommodation wasn't a commercial success in itself. It was slow, unreliable, and expensive to operate. The journey from Montreal to Quebec City took 36 hours, which wasn't much faster than a sailing vessel under good conditions. But it established Molson as a player in the transportation industry. And more importantly, it gave him relationships with the government, officials who controlled navigation rights on the St. Lawrence. Over the next 2 decades, Molson built and operated multiple steamships, each one better than the last. The Swiftsure, launched in 1812, was a marked improvement. By the 1820s, Molson's fleet was the dominant carrier on the Montreal-Quebec City route. His ships connected the two most important cities in Lower Canada. If you wanted to move goods or people along the St. Lawrence, you were almost certainly paying a Molson. Then came banking. In 1822, John Molson was one of the principal founders of the Bank of Montreal. Today, the Bank of Montreal is the 8th largest bank in North America by assets. It's one of the big 5 Canadian banks, and it started with beer money. The founding of the Bank of Montreal is a perfect illustration of how the dynasty system worked. You didn't just start a bank because you had money. You started a bank because you had relationships with the other wealthy merchants in the colony, and collectively, you recognized that controlling the financial system was more profitable than any individual business could ever be. The original shareholders of the Bank of Montreal read like a who's who of early Canadian commerce. John Molson was joined by other prominent Montreal merchants, many of whom were also involved in the fur trade, timber, and shipping. These were men who already controlled significant portions of the colonial economy. The bank gave them a formal mechanism to pool their capital, extend credit to their allies, and deny it to their competitors. This is a crucial point that gets glossed over in most histories of Canadian banking. Early Canadian banks were not public utilities. They were not founded to serve the general population. They were founded by wealthy merchants to serve their own commercial interests. The Bank of Montreal's original charter gave its directors enormous discretion over who could receive loans and on what terms. If you were in the network, you got access to capital. If you weren't, good luck. John Molson also served in the colonial legislature, sitting on the Legislative Council of Lower Canada. This gave him direct influence over the laws and regulations governing commerce, banking, and transportation in the colony. He wasn't just operating within the system, he was helping to write the rules. John Molson died in 1836, but the family was just getting started. His sons, John Molson Jr. and William Molson, expanded the brewing operations significantly while maintaining the family's interests in banking, shipping, and now real estate. William Molson would go on to become president of the Molson's Bank, a separate financial institution the family founded in 1855 that operated independently until it was absorbed into the Bank of Montreal in 1925. The third generation expanded even further. John H.R. Molson served as president of the Molson's Bank and was involved in the telegraph industry, railroads, and insurance. The family's interests spread across the entire Canadian economy like roots from a single tree. Think about that for a moment. One family controlled a major brewery, a steamship line, significant real estate holdings in Montreal, and not one but 2 banking institutions. All within about 50 years of John Molson stepping off a boat with his inheritance. And the Molsons weren't doing this in a free market. They were doing it in a colonial economy where government connections, monopoly privileges, and insider relationships determined who succeeded and who didn't. Every contract, every license, every land grant involved a decision by someone in power, and the Molsons were always in the room when those decisions were made. The pattern is clear. Arrive with some capital. Find a market with no competition. Use government connections to secure your position. Diversify into infrastructure and finance. Build relationships with other wealthy families. Create a closed system that's nearly impossible for outsiders to break into. John Molson did it with beer. The next family did it with ships. Section 3. Hugh Allen and the Atlantic Monopoly. If the Molson story seems improbable, the Hugh Allen story is downright absurd. Allen was born in 1810 in Saltcoats, a small town on the west coast of Scotland. His father was a ship captain of modest means. At age 13, Hugh Allen sailed to Montreal to work as a clerk for a dry goods merchant. 13 years old, working in a counting house in a colonial backwater with no family connections in the colony, no inherited wealth, and no obvious path to power. 30 years later, he was the richest man in Canada. The official version of the story goes something like this. Allen was hardworking, shrewd, and entrepreneurial. He learned the shipping business from the ground up, saved his money, bought his first ship, and gradually built the Allen Line into the dominant shipping company on the North Atlantic route between Canada and Britain. And that's all true, but it leaves out the part that actually explains how he got there. Hugh Allen's rise happened because of a very specific feature of the colonial economy. The British government subsidized mail delivery between Britain and its colonies, and those mail contracts were absurdly lucrative. Whoever held the mail contract for the Canada route essentially had a guaranteed income stream from the government, plus the ability to carry passengers and cargo on ships that were already being paid for by public money. Allen spent years cultivating relationships with politicians on both sides of the Atlantic to secure those mail contracts. He lobbied British postal officials. He wined and dined Canadian legislators. He made strategic investments in political campaigns. And it worked. By the 1850s, the Allen Line held the primary mail contract for the Canada route, which gave them a massive competitive advantage over any rival shipping company. The mail contract was worth tens of thousands of pounds annually, and it was renewed repeatedly, giving Allen a stable base of government revenue on which to build his commercial operations. Think of it as a guaranteed floor beneath his business. Even if passenger traffic dipped or cargo rates fell, the mail contract kept the ships running and the money flowing. With government money underwriting his fleet, Allen could afford to build bigger, faster, more modern ships than anyone else. He introduced iron steamships to the Canada route when his competitors were still relying on wooden sailing vessels. He established regular scheduled service when others were still operating on irregular timetables. He controlled the immigration trade, carrying hundreds of thousands of European immigrants to Canada over the decades. The immigration business was particularly profitable and particularly consequential. Allen didn't just carry immigrants passively, he actively recruited them. The Allen Line had agents throughout Britain and Ireland, and eventually in Scandinavia and continental Europe, who promoted emigration to Canada and sold tickets for the crossing. These agents were paid on commission, which meant they had every incentive to oversell the opportunities in Canada and understate the hardships. The conditions on Allen's ships, particularly in steerage class where the poorest immigrants traveled, were often appalling. Overcrowding, inadequate food and water, unsanitary conditions, and disease were common. Several Allen Line ships experienced outbreaks of cholera, typhus, and other diseases during the crossing. The death toll among immigrants on these voyages was not trivial. And here's where it gets really interesting. The immigrants Allen carried weren't just passengers, they were the labor force that was building Canada. The men who laid railroad tracks, cleared farmland, dug canals, and built cities arrived in Canada on Allen's ships. He was, in a very literal sense, importing the people who would make the other wealthy families' investments profitable. By the 1860s, Hugh Allen wasn't just a shipping magnate. He was involved in banking, insurance, manufacturing, and telegraph companies. He sat on the boards of multiple financial institutions. He was the president of the Merchants Bank of Canada. He owned a massive estate in Montreal called Ravenscrag, which was the largest private residence in the country. The house had 72 rooms, 72, for one family. But Allen's most famous, or infamous, moment came in 1873, and it nearly brought down the entire Canadian government. The Pacific Scandal, as it became known, was one of the biggest political crises in Canadian history. Here's what happened. After Confederation in 1867, the new Canadian government promised British Columbia that it would build a transcontinental railroad to connect the province to the rest of the country. This was the single largest infrastructure project ever attempted in Canada, and the contract to build it was worth an astronomical sum. Hugh Allen wanted that contract, and he was willing to pay for it. During the federal election of 1872, Allen funneled massive amounts of money to the Conservative Party of Prime Minister John A. Macdonald. We're talking about contributions that were enormous, even by the standards of the time. Estimates suggest Allen contributed somewhere in the range of $300,000 to $360,000 to Macdonald's campaign, which in today's money would be roughly $8 million to $10 million. In return, Allen expected to receive the charter for the Canadian Pacific Railway. The scheme unraveled when a disgruntled associate leaked telegrams proving the arrangement. One of the most famous documents in Canadian political history is a telegram from John A. Macdonald to Allen that reads, in part, "I must have another 10,000. It was, in plain language, the Prime Minister of Canada asking a private businessman for a bribe. The scandal forced Macdonald to resign as Prime Minister in 1873. It's one of the few moments in Canadian history where the cozy relationship between government and business was exposed in a way that couldn't be ignored or explained away. But here's the thing that should make you stop and think. The Pacific scandal is treated as an aberration in Canadian history, a shocking exception to an otherwise clean system. But was it really an exception, or was it simply the one time the system got caught? Everything we know about how power operated in colonial and early Confederation-era Canada suggests that the Allen-Macdonald arrangement was the norm, not the exception. Government contracts went to politically connected businessmen. Politicians received financial support from those businessmen. The difference with the Pacific scandal wasn't that it happened. It was that someone wrote it down. Hugh Allen never got the railroad contract. That prize went to a different group of men, a syndicate that would become even more powerful than Allen ever was, and their story is arguably the most important chapter in the creation of Canada's permanent elite. Section 4. The CPR Syndicate, George Stephen, Donald Smith, and the railroad that built an aristocracy. If you want to understand how Canada's wealthiest families truly consolidated their power, you have to understand the Canadian Pacific Railway, not just as a railroad, but as a mechanism for transferring public wealth into private hands on a scale that makes the Pacific scandal look like pocket change. The CPR was, without exaggeration, the most important economic event in Canadian history. It connected the country from coast to coast. It opened the prairies to settlement. It made Western expansion possible. It was the physical backbone of Confederation. It was also a private company that received from the Canadian government $25 million in cash, equivalent to roughly $750 million today, 25 million acres of land in the western prairies, that's an area larger than many European countries, completed railroad sections already built by the government worth an additional $25 to $30 million, tax exemptions on the land and the railroad itself for 20 years, a monopoly clause preventing any competing railroad from being built, south of the CPR line for 20 years, and duty-free import of all construction materials. Let me put those 25 million acres in perspective. That's roughly 100,000 square kilometers. That's larger than Portugal, larger than Hungary, larger than South Korea. One private company received a tract of land bigger than most nations, for free, as an incentive to build a railroad. That's not a business deal. That's a country handing its most valuable assets to a private syndicate. The men who received this extraordinary package were George Stephen, Donald Smith, James Jerome Hill, and Duncan McIntyre. They're known collectively as the CPR Syndicate, and their story reads like a masterclass in how a small group of connected individuals can capture an entire economy. George Stephen was born in 1829 in Dufftown, Scotland. He came to Montreal as a young man and went to work for his cousin, a dry goods merchant. By the 1860s, Stephen had built a successful textile business and had become involved in banking. He was elected president of the Bank of Montreal in 1876, which at the time was effectively Canada's central bank. Let me repeat that. The man who would negotiate the terms of the CPR contract with the Canadian government was simultaneously the president of the country's most powerful financial institution. He wasn't just asking for government money. He was the person who controlled how money moved through the entire Canadian economy. Donald Smith had an even more remarkable trajectory. Born in 1820 in Forres, Scotland, Smith came to Canada as a teenager and spent decades working for the Hudson's Bay Company in remote fur trading posts across the Northwest. He lived for years in isolated posts in Labrador and the Mackenzie River District, enduring conditions that would have broken most men. Temperatures of 40 below zero. Months without seeing another European face. A diet of whatever could be hunted or traded. But Smith was patient and ambitious. He rose steadily through the HBC hierarchy, gaining intimate knowledge of the land, the trade routes, and the indigenous peoples who were essential to the company's operations. He eventually became the company's chief commissioner in Canada and later its governor. The Hudson's Bay Company, it's worth remembering, had controlled an area of North America called Rupert's Land that encompassed roughly a third of the modern Canadian landmass. When the Canadian government purchased Rupert's Land from the Hudson's Bay Company in 1870 for £300,000, Donald Smith was on both sides of the transaction. He represented the company selling the land, and he was a Canadian politician involved in the government buying it. Smith was elected to the Canadian Parliament in 1871 and would go on to serve in various political roles while simultaneously building his business empire. The conflict of interest was so obvious that it was occasionally commented upon, but never actually stopped. In fact, Smith was so brazen about mixing his political and business roles that he was censured by Parliament in 1878 for his behavior during the Pacific Scandal. The censure had no practical consequences whatsoever. The relationship between Stephen and Smith was the foundation of the CPR syndicate. They were cousins. They were business partners. They were both connected to the Bank of Montreal, and they both understood that the Transcontinental Railroad represented the single greatest opportunity for wealth creation in Canadian history. Before even bidding on the CPR, Stephen and Smith had already tested the railroad business model. In 1878, they purchased the bankrupt St. Paul and Pacific Railroad in Minnesota, restructured it, and sold it for an enormous profit. This experience gave them both the expertise and the confidence to take on the much larger CPR project. When the syndicate received the CPR charter in 1881, they inherited a project that most people considered impossible. The railroad had to cross the Canadian Shield, a vast expanse of granite and muskeg in northern Ontario. It had to traverse the prairies, which had no existing infrastructure, and it had to punch through the Rocky Mountains, which had defeated every previous survey expedition. The construction of the CPR is one of the genuinely impressive feats of engineering in the 19th century. 15,000 workers, many of them Chinese laborers brought to Canada specifically for the project, blasted tunnels through mountains, built bridges across gorges, and laid thousands of miles of track through some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. The human cost was staggering. Chinese workers in particular were paid a fraction of what white workers received, typically $1 per day compared to $2 to $3 for white workers. They were housed in terrible conditions, fed inadequate rations, and exposed to constant danger from explosions, rock slides, and disease. Estimates of the number of Chinese workers who died during construction range from 600 to over 2,000. Their contribution to building Canada is one of the great unacknowledged debts in the country's history, and the government's response to the Chinese workers who survived was revealing. In 1885, the same year the railroad was completed, Canada imposed the Chinese Immigration Act, which required Chinese immigrants to pay a 50 lo head tax to enter the country. This tax was later increased to $100 and then $500. The message was clear. Canada was happy to use Chinese labor to build its infrastructure, but it didn't want Chinese people to stay and share in the benefits of what they'd built. But while the workers suffered, the syndicate prospered. And they prospered not just from the railroad itself, but from everything the railroad made possible. Remember those 25 million acres of land? The CPR didn't just sit on them. They sold them to settlers, often to the very immigrants who were being carried to the prairies on CPR trains. The company aggressively promoted immigration to Western Canada, particularly from Eastern Europe, because every new settler meant a land sale and a future customer for the railroad. The CPR's colonization department produced promotional materials in dozens of languages, distributed across Europe, painting the Canadian prairies as a land of opportunity. The last best West, one slogan proclaimed. These campaigns brought hundreds of thousands of immigrants to the prairies, and every one of them represented revenue for the CPR, ticket sales, land sales, and ongoing freight charges as they shipped their grain to market on CPR trains. George Stephen and Donald Smith also profited enormously from their other investments, which were directly enhanced by the railroad. The Bank of Montreal financed many of the businesses that sprang up along the CPR route. The Hudson's Bay Company's remaining landholdings in the West skyrocketed in value once the railroad made them accessible. By the time the CPR was completed in 1885, marked by the famous Last Spike ceremony at Craigellachie, British Columbia, where Donald Smith drove in the final spike, the syndicate members had transformed themselves from wealthy businessmen into something more. They were functionally the owners of Western Canada. George Stephen was made Baron Mount Stephen by Queen Victoria in 1891, the first Canadian-born person to receive a hereditary peerage. Donald Smith became Baron Strathcona in 1897. These weren't honorary titles. They were recognition by the British Crown that these men had achieved a status equivalent to the landed aristocracy of Britain itself. And that's exactly what they were. Canada, the country that likes to think of itself as egalitarian, as fundamentally different from the old European class systems, had created its own aristocracy in a single generation, not through birth or bloodlines, but through the systematic capture of public resources for private gain. The CPR syndicate model would be replicated again and again in Canadian history. A small group of connected individuals identifies a critical piece of infrastructure. They negotiate terms with a government that needs the infrastructure built, but lacks the capital or expertise to do it publicly. The terms are extraordinarily favorable to the private group. The public bears most of the risk, while the private group captures most of the reward. And the resulting wealth is so enormous that it becomes self-perpetuating, passing from generation to generation and expanding into new industries with each passing decade. If that pattern sounds familiar, it's because it's still happening today. Different industries, different families, same basic mechanism, but the CPR syndicate wasn't the only group of newcomers getting rich during this period. While Stephen and Smith were building their railroad empire in the West, a quiet Irishman in Toronto was doing something just as revolutionary in the world of retail. Section 5, Timothy Eaton and the Invention of Canadian Consumer Culture. Timothy Eaton's story is the one that gets told the most often and understood the least. The popular version goes like this. A poor Irish immigrant arrives in Canada, works hard, opens a small dry goods store on Yonge Street in Toronto in 1869, introduces revolutionary retail practices like fixed prices and money-back guarantees, and builds the largest department store chain in Canadian history. It's a classic bootstrap story, the Canadian dream in action. But like most bootstrap stories, the popular version smooths over the parts that actually explain how it happened. Timothy Eaton was born in 1834 in Ballymena, in what is now Northern Ireland. His family was indeed poor, and he did indeed immigrate to Canada in 1854 at the age of 20. But he didn't arrive as a helpless newcomer with nothing to his name. He came to join his older brothers, who were already established in Ontario and working as merchants. This is a detail that gets omitted from most retellings, and it matters. Eaton didn't walk into a completely unfamiliar country with no connections. He had family, he had a trade, and he had a community. The Irish Protestant community in Ontario was a significant economic and social network tied to the Orange Order and connected to political power in the province. Eaton was embedded in it from the moment he arrived. Eaton spent 15 years working as a merchant in small Ontario towns, first in Glen Williams and then in St. Mary's, before opening his famous Toronto store. By the time he launched the Yonge Street location, he was an experienced retailer who understood the Canadian market intimately. This wasn't a gamble. It was a calculated move by someone who had spent a decade and a half studying the industry. What Eaton did in Toronto was genuinely innovative. The standard retail practice at the time was the haggle system. Prices were not fixed. Merchants would quote a high price, and customers would negotiate down. The quality of goods was inconsistent, returns were rarely accepted, and the entire transaction was based on the relative negotiating skill of the buyer and seller. Eaton changed all of that. Fixed prices meant that every customer paid the same amount. The money-back guarantee meant that if you were dissatisfied, you could return the product. And perhaps most importantly, Eaton paid cash for his inventory instead of buying on credit, which meant he could negotiate better prices from suppliers and pass those savings on to customers. These innovations sound obvious to us now, but in 1869 they were radical, and they gave Eaton a massive competitive advantage over traditional merchants who were still operating on the old system. But here's where the story gets more complicated than the bootstrap narrative suggests. Eaton's innovations didn't just succeed because they were good ideas. They succeeded because they arrived at exactly the right moment in Canadian economic history. The 1870s and 1880s were a period of rapid urbanization in Ontario. Toronto was growing fast, fueled by immigration and the expansion of the railroad network. A new urban middle class was emerging, people who had money to spend but who were fed up with the haggle system and the inconsistent quality of traditional merchants. They wanted reliability, transparency, and convenience. Eaton gave them exactly that. Eaton didn't create this market. He recognized it, and he positioned himself to capture it before anyone else did. The real engine of Eaton's growth, though, wasn't the Toronto store. It was the mail order catalog. In 1884, Eaton published his first catalog, a small pamphlet listing a selection of goods that could be ordered by mail. Within a few years, the Eaton's catalog had become one of the most important documents in Canadian domestic life. In rural communities across the country, where the nearest store might be a day's ride away, the Eaton's catalog was the primary connection to the consumer economy. The catalog was more than a sales tool. It was a cultural artifact. Farm families used it to furnish their homes, clothe their children, and equip their operations. In some communities, it was the only source of information about what products existed in the wider world. Generations of Canadians grew up with the Eaton's catalog as a fixture in their homes, arriving seasonally like the weather, thick enough to serve as a doorstop, or famously, as reading material in outhouses across rural Canada. And the catalog business was phenomenally profitable. Eaton was essentially operating a centralized distribution system decades before anyone else figured out how to do it at scale. He bought in enormous volumes, which gave him pricing power over suppliers. He shipped by rail, taking advantage of the infrastructure that families like the CPR syndicate had built, and he reached customers that no physical store could economically serve. By the time Timothy Eaton died in 1907, his company was the largest retail operation in Canada. The Toronto flagship store occupied an entire city block. Branch stores were opening across the country, and the Eaton family had become one of the wealthiest and most prominent families in Canadian society. The next generations expanded the empire further. John Craig, Eaton, Timothy's son, took over the company and continued the expansion. He built a massive factory complex in Toronto, the largest garment manufacturing operation in Canada. The family built Eaton's College Street, a massive Art Deco department store in Toronto that included a concert hall, restaurants, and an auditorium. They accumulated vast real estate holdings. They became philanthropists, society figures, and cultural patrons. John Craig Eaton was knighted in 1915, becoming Sir John Eaton. But underneath the glamour, the Eaton's empire was built on some practices that don't fit neatly into the bootstrap narrative. The company was notorious for its treatment of workers. Eaton's fought unionization aggressively for decades. In 1912, there was a significant strike at the Toronto garment factory that was brutally suppressed. Workers were paid low wages, expected to work long hours in often dangerous conditions, and could be fired without cause. The company hired private detectives to infiltrate union organizing efforts and fired workers suspected of union sympathies. The Eaton family's anti-union stance was so extreme that it became a defining feature of Toronto labor history. The 1912 strike and subsequent organizing efforts in the 1930s and 1940s were all defeated. Eaton's remained a non-union shop throughout its existence, a remarkable achievement given the size of its workforce and the intensity of labor. Organizing efforts in the Canadian garment industry. The wealth that built the Eaton family's mansions and art collections and charitable foundations came, in significant part, from the underpaid labor of thousands of employees. The company also wielded enormous power over its suppliers. Because Eaton's was by far the largest retailer in Canada, manufacturers were heavily dependent on Eaton's orders. The company used this leverage to demand lower and lower prices, which squeezed suppliers' margins and pushed the cost savings down to the workers at the manufacturing level. This is the part of the Eaton story that doesn't make it into the heritage minutes. The happy customers and the revolutionary retail practices existed alongside a labor system that extracted maximum value from workers at every level of the supply chain. Timothy Eaton didn't appear from nowhere. He arrived at a specific moment, in a specific economic context, with specific advantages that allowed him to build an empire. The same pattern we've seen with every family so far. Speaking of markets that rewarded first movers, let's talk about the family that literally built the machines that transformed Canada from a wilderness into a breadbasket. Section 6. The Massey Family. Machines, Money, and the Mechanization of a Continent. Daniel Massey started his workshop in Newcastle, Ontario in 1847. He was a farmer's son who had a talent for metalworking, and his original products were simple agricultural implements, plows, cultivators, basic tools for the kind of subsistence farming that dominated rural Ontario at the time. There's nothing particularly remarkable about the founding story. Dozens of similar workshops existed across Upper Canada in the mid-1800s, small-scale blacksmiths and mechanics producing tools for local farmers. What made Massey different wasn't the start, it was the timing of what came next. The 1850s and 1860s were the decades when Canadian agriculture began its transformation from subsistence farming to commercial production. The Reciprocity Treaty of 1854 opened American markets to Canadian grain. The Crimean War disrupted Russian wheat exports to Europe, creating demand for North American grain. And the expansion of the railroad network made it economically feasible to ship grain from the Canadian interior to ports for export. Suddenly, there was an enormous incentive for Canadian farmers to increase their production. And increasing production meant mechanization. You couldn't harvest 1,000 acres of wheat with a scythe and a couple of helpers. You needed machines. Daniel Massey saw this coming, or more accurately, his son Hart Massey saw it coming. Hart Massey took over the family business in the 1850s and immediately began scaling up. He moved from simple hand tools to complex mechanical harvesters, reapers, and threshers. He invested in factory production rather than workshop craftsmanship, and he positioned the company to be the primary domestic supplier of farm equipment at exactly the moment when every farmer in Canada was desperate to mechanize. The growth was explosive. By the 1870s, Massey Manufacturing Company was the largest farm equipment manufacturer in the British Empire. The company exhibited at international expositions in Paris, Philadelphia, and Vienna, winning awards for the quality of its machinery and building its reputation as a world-class manufacturer. Hart Massey moved the company's headquarters from Newcastle to Toronto in 1879, recognizing that the city's superior rail connections and access to capital made it the better location for a growing industrial enterprise. The new Toronto factory was one of the largest manufacturing facilities in Canada. In 1891, the company merged with its primary domestic competitor, A. Harris, Son and Company of Brantford, Ontario, to form Massey Harris. The merger eliminated the last significant challenger to Massey's dominance of the Canadian farm equipment market and created a company with a near monopoly on agricultural machinery in the country. Think about what that means in practical terms. If you were a Canadian farmer in the late 1800s or early 1900s, and you needed a harvester, or a thresher, or a plow, you were almost certainly buying it from Massey Harris. The company didn't just sell you the equipment. They financed it, often through credit arrangements that kept farmers in debt to the company for years. They supplied replacement parts, which had to come from Massey Harris because the equipment was proprietary. They provided servicing, which only Massey Harris mechanics could properly do. It was a vertically integrated system that captured farmers at every stage of the production process. And because agriculture was the backbone of the Canadian economy, controlling farm equipment meant controlling, in a real sense, the means of production for the entire country. The company eventually merged with the Ferguson Tractor Company in 1953 to become Massey Ferguson, which became one of the largest agricultural equipment manufacturers in the world. At its peak, Massey Ferguson had operations in dozens of countries and employed tens of thousands of workers. The Massey family leveraged this wealth into every other sector of Canadian elite life. Hart Massey was one of the great philanthropists of the era. He donated the money for Massey Hall, the iconic Toronto concert venue that still operates today and has hosted everyone from Winston Churchill to Neil Young. He funded Methodist churches, hospitals, and educational institutions across Ontario. His son Chester Massey continued the philanthropic tradition, funding what would become Hart House at the University of Toronto, one of the most important student centers in Canadian university life. Chester's son Vincent Massey became the first Canadian-born governor, General of Canada in 1952, the ultimate integration of business wealth and political power. Think about that trajectory. From a blacksmith's workshop in rural Ontario to the vice-regal residence at Rideau Hall in 4 generations. That's not just a family success story, that's the creation of a governing class. These donations are typically presented as acts of generosity, and on one level they were. But philanthropy in the Gilded Age also served a very specific social function. It legitimized the wealth. When your name is on a concert hall, a university building, a hospital wing, people stop asking how you got the money. The institutions become part of the cultural landscape, and the family name becomes synonymous with contribution rather than extraction. The masses weren't just giving back. They were buying their place in the national story. Section 7. John Redpath and the Sugar Monopoly. John Redpath is one of those names that most Canadians recognize but can't quite place. They know Redpath Sugar, the brand with the distinctive logo that's been on Canadian kitchen tables for generations. But they don't know the man behind it or the system that made the sugar fortune possible. Redpath was born in 1796 in Berwickshire, Scotland, and came to Montreal in 1816 as a stonemason. He was skilled at his trade, and he arrived at another one of those perfect historical moments. Montreal, in the 1810s and 1820s, was rebuilding and expanding rapidly. The War of 1812 had just ended, immigration was increasing, and the city needed infrastructure. Roads, buildings, canals, all of it required skilled construction workers. Redpath quickly established himself as a contractor and won several major government construction projects. He worked on the Lachine Canal, one of the most important pieces of commercial infrastructure in Lower Canada, which bypassed the rapids on the St. Lawrence River and allowed ships to travel between Montreal and the Great Lakes. He also did work on the Rideau Canal, a massive military engineering project connecting Ottawa to Kingston. These were huge public works, financed by the British military and colonial government, and the contracts were awarded to a small number of established contractors who had relationships with the commissioning authorities. Again, the pattern. Government spending directed to connected individuals, creating the initial capital accumulation that would fund everything that came after. The canal contracts made Redpath wealthy, but it was his next move that created the dynasty. By the 1840s, Redpath had accumulated enough money from construction to look for new investment opportunities, and he found one that was remarkably lucrative: sugar refining. In the mid-1800s, sugar was one of the most important commodities in the global economy. Raw sugar was produced in the Caribbean, primarily by enslaved or recently emancipated laborers on plantation colonies. It was then shipped to refineries in North America and Europe, where it was processed into the white granulated sugar that consumers bought. The refining process was capital intensive. It required expensive equipment, large buildings, specialized knowledge, and significant working capital. This meant that entry into the sugar refining business had high barriers, which in turn meant limited competition. Redpath opened his sugar refinery in Montreal in 1854. It was the first sugar refinery in all of Canada, and for years it was essentially the only one. Canada's tariff system protected domestic refineries from foreign competition. The government imposed duties on refined sugar imports while allowing raw sugar to enter at lower rates. This meant that Redpath could buy cheap raw sugar from the Caribbean, refine it in Montreal, and sell it across Canada at prices that were competitive domestically but would never face meaningful foreign competition. It was a government-created monopoly, not through a formal charter, but through tariff policy that made it uneconomical for anyone to compete. There's an uncomfortable dimension to the Redpath sugar story that deserves attention. The raw sugar that fueled the refinery came from Caribbean plantations, where the labor force consisted of formerly enslaved people and their descendants, working under conditions that, while technically free labor, often resembled slavery in everything but name. The plantation system that produced cheap raw sugar was a legacy of the transatlantic slave trade, and the profits from Canadian sugar refining were built on the foundation of that system. This doesn't mean that Redpath personally endorsed or participated in slavery. By the 1850s, slavery had been abolished throughout the British Empire, but the economic system he profited from was a direct descendant of the slave economy, and the low price of raw sugar that made his refinery profitable was a function of the exploitative labor conditions on Caribbean plantations. The Redpath refinery grew steadily through the latter half of the 1800s. John Redpath died in 1869, but his sons Peter and John James continued the business. Peter Redpath became one of Montreal's most prominent citizens, serving on multiple boards and engaging in extensive philanthropy. He donated generously to McGill University, funding the Redpath Library, the Redpath Museum of Natural History, and the Peter Redpath Hall. His contributions to McGill were so significant that he was considered one of the university's most important benefactors. Like the Masseys in Toronto, the Redpaths in Montreal used philanthropy to cement their social position and legitimize their wealth. The buildings with their names on them served as permanent monuments to the family's generosity, diverting attention from the question of how the fortune was accumulated in the first place. Now, you might be thinking, okay, so a handful of families got rich in the 1800s. That happened everywhere. What makes Canada different? That's actually the right question, and the answer lies not in the individual stories, which are remarkable enough, but in how all of these families connected to each other, because the real power wasn't in any single fortune, it was in the network. Section 8, the web, how every dynasty connected to every other. Here's something that historians have documented extensively, but that rarely makes it into popular accounts of Canadian history. The families we've been talking about weren't independent operators. They weren't rivals competing in a free market. They were a network, interconnected through marriage, business partnerships, shared board memberships, and social institutions. Let's trace some of the connections. The Bank of Montreal, which the Molsons helped found in 1822, was the financial institution used by virtually every other wealthy family we've discussed. George Stephen, the CPR syndicate leader, was president of the Bank of Montreal. Hugh Allen banked with them. The Redpaths banked with them. The bank served as a central node connecting all of these interests. The CPR connected the Massey farm equipment empire to the Western settlers, who were the primary customers for Massey Harris machinery. CPR promotional campaigns encouraging immigration to the prairies directly benefited Massey, because more settlers meant more farms, which meant more equipment sales. Hugh Allen's shipping line brought the immigrants to Canada, who then traveled west on CPR trains, bought land from the CPR's land holdings, and purchased Massey Harris equipment to farm that land. The entire chain, from embarkation in Europe to a functioning farm on the prairies, was controlled at every stage by this interconnected group of families. The Eatons sold goods to these same settlers through their mail order catalog, which was distributed along the CPR rail network. Eaton's department stores in major cities served the urban middle class that was growing as a result of the industrialization that all of these families were collectively driving, and all of them sweetened their tea with Redpath sugar. The social connections were just as tight as the business ones. These families intermarried extensively. Their children attended the same private schools, Upper Canada College for boys, Bishop Strachan. School for girls. They belonged to the same clubs, the Mount Royal Club in Montreal and the Toronto Club in Ontario being the most exclusive. They worshipped at the same churches. They vacationed at the same summer retreats in Muskoka and the eastern townships. The Mount Royal Club deserves special mention because it illustrates how the network operated socially. Founded in 1899, it was Montreal's most exclusive private club, and its membership roster read like a directory of Canadian economic power. To be a member, you had to be proposed by existing members and approved by the membership committee, which meant the club was self-selecting. The families controlled who got in, which meant they controlled who got access to the social relationships that facilitated business deals. Many major business transactions in Canadian history were negotiated not in boardrooms, but in the dining rooms and lounges of these private clubs. The deals were done before they were officially announced. The decisions were made before the boards met. The real power was exercised in private, among people who had known each other for generations. The practice of interlocking directorates, where the same individuals serve on the boards of multiple companies, was widespread and openly practiced. A man might simultaneously sit on the board of a bank, a railroad, a manufacturing company, and a natural resource extraction firm. This gave him oversight of how capital was allocated across the entire economy. He could direct bank lending toward companies he was involved in. He could ensure that railroad routes served his manufacturing interests. He could coordinate pricing and production across industries that were theoretically independent. Consider the case of Sir Herbert Holt, who arrived from Ireland in 1875 and rose to become president of the Royal Bank of Canada. At the peak of his influence in the 1920s and 1930s, Holt sat on the boards of over 300 companies. 300, one man connected to 300 different enterprises. He was described as the most powerful man in Canada, and nobody had elected him to anything. Holt's board positions spanned banking, insurance, utilities, manufacturing, mining, forestry, and real estate. He could influence lending decisions at the Royal Bank that affected companies where he was also a director. He could coordinate strategy across industries that were supposedly independent. The concentration of decision-making power in his hands, and in the hands of the small group of men who operated similarly, was extraordinary. John Porter, a Canadian sociologist, published a landmark study in 1965 called The Vertical Mosaic that documented this elite cohesion in devastating detail. Porter found that a tiny percentage of Canadians controlled a vastly disproportionate share of the country's wealth and power, and that membership in this elite was heavily determined by ethnic origin, British and to some extent French, religion, Protestant, educational background, private schools and a few elite universities, and family connections. Porter's work showed that Canada's self-image as an egalitarian society was, to put it bluntly, a myth. The country had a class structure that was just as rigid and just as hereditary as anything in Britain or the United States. The difference was that Canadians refused to acknowledge it, and that refusal to acknowledge it is perhaps the most important part of the story. But before we move on to the next generation of families, there's one more mechanism that needs to be understood, because it's arguably the most important one, the one that tied everything else together and made the whole system function. Banking. Section 9. The banking monopoly. How a few families controlled all the money. You can own a brewery, a shipping line, a railroad, a department store, and a sugar refinery. But if someone else controls the banking system, they control you. The families we've been discussing understood this instinctively, which is why so many of them ended up in banking. In the early 1800s, Canada had almost no financial infrastructure. There were no banks, no insurance companies, no formal credit markets. If you needed capital to start a business, you had to bring it with you from Britain, or borrow it informally from other merchants. This created an enormous opportunity for anyone who could establish a formal banking institution. The Bank of Montreal, founded in 1817 and incorporated by Act of Parliament in 1822, was the first permanent bank in British North America. Its founding shareholders were the same Montreal merchants who dominated the fur trade, the timber industry, and the shipping business. The Molson family, as we discussed, was among them. What made the Bank of Montreal so important wasn't just that it was first, it was that it served, until the creation of the Bank of Canada in 1934 as the government's banker. The federal government deposited its revenue in the Bank of Montreal. The bank managed government accounts, processed government payments, and handled the government's foreign exchange transactions. This gave the bank's directors an intimate view of government finances and an extraordinary degree of influence over fiscal policy. The relationship between the Bank of Montreal and the federal government was so close that it blurred the line between public and private institutions. When the government needed to borrow money, it often went to the Bank of Montreal first. When the bank's directors wanted favorable legislation, they had direct access to the ministers who wrote the laws. Other banks followed: the Bank of Upper Canada, the Commercial Bank of the Midland District, the Quebec Bank, the Bank of Toronto, the Canadian Bank of Commerce. By Confederation in 1867, there were dozens of chartered banks in Canada. But here's the critical detail: the banking system was never really competitive. The number of banks shrank steadily through the late 1800s and early 1900s as larger banks absorbed smaller ones. Bank failures, mergers, and acquisitions concentrated the industry into fewer and fewer hands. The 5 banks that would come to dominate Canadian banking, the Bank of Montreal, the Royal Bank of Canada, the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce, the Toronto Dominion Bank, and the Bank of Nova Scotia, collectively known as the Big Five, emerged from this process of consolidation. Today, these 5 banks hold the vast majority of Canadian banking assets. The concentration of the Canadian banking sector is among the highest of any developed economy in the world. And who controlled these banks during their formative years? The same families we've been talking about. George Stephen of the CPR Syndicate was president of the Bank of Montreal. George Gooderham of the Distilling family was president of the Bank of Toronto. Sir Herbert Holt was president of the Royal Bank of Canada. The boards of these institutions were drawn from the same tiny pool of wealthy, adaptive, interconnected families. The banking system served as the nervous system of the oligarchy. It connected all the other industries and allowed the families to coordinate their activities. A bank director, who was also on the board of a railroad, could ensure that the railroad received favorable lending terms. A bank director, who was also a major real estate investor, could influence which neighborhoods received development loans and which didn't. A bank director, who was also a politician, could shape banking regulation to protect the interests of the banks he was running. The Bank Act, Canada's federal banking legislation, was reviewed and renewed every 10 years. Each renewal was an opportunity for the banking lobby to shape the rules in their favor. And because the banks were run by the same families who funded political campaigns and sat in the Senate, the Bank Act consistently reflected the bank's interests. One of the most significant features of Canadian banking law is the prohibition on foreign bank entry. For most of Canadian history, foreign banks were either barred from operating in Canada or severely restricted in what they could do. This protected the Big Five from international competition and ensured that the same Canadian families maintained control of the financial system, generation after generation. The result is a banking sector that is remarkably profitable, remarkably stable, and remarkably concentrated. The Big Five Canadian banks are among the most profitable financial institutions in the world, consistently generating returns that exceed their international peers. And that profitability flows ultimately to the shareholders and directors who control them. Canadian consumers and businesses, meanwhile, pay some of the highest banking fees in the developed world. Mortgage rates, credit card interest rates, and transaction fees in Canada are consistently higher than in countries with more competitive banking sectors. The difference between what Canadians pay and what they would pay in a more competitive market represents a transfer of wealth from the general population to the banking families year after year, decade after decade. It's the most elegant form of wealth extraction imaginable. Invisible, legal, permanent, and virtually unquestioned. Now, with the banking system understood, let's look at how the next generation of families use the same playbook. Section 10, the next wave, families that inherited the blueprint. The families of the 1800s didn't just build empires, they built a template, and the families that followed them in the late 1800s and early 1900s used that template to build empires of their own, often in industries the original dynasties hadn't reached. The Bronfman family is perhaps the most striking example. Samuel Bronfman's parents, Yechil and Minnie Bronfman, arrived in Canada from Bessarabia, modern-day Moldova, in 1889. They were part of a wave of Jewish immigration from the Russian Empire, fleeing pogroms and economic persecution. They settled in Manitoba, far from the power centers of Montreal and Toronto, and operated a series of small businesses, including a fuel business and eventually hotels. The hotel business was the key. In early 20th century Manitoba, hotels were one of the few establishments licensed to sell alcohol. The Bronfmans learned the liquor trade through their hotel operations, and they recognized the immense profitability of alcohol distribution. When Prohibition hit the United States in 1920, the Bronfmans were positioned to exploit one of the most lucrative arbitrage opportunities in North American history. Canada had its own prohibition laws, but they were province by province and riddled with loopholes. More importantly, it was legal to manufacture alcohol in Canada for export. The fact that the export destination, the United States, had made alcohol illegal was technically not Canada's problem. The Bronfmans built a liquor distribution business that operated in the gray area between Canadian legality and American illegality. They sold enormous quantities of whiskey to intermediaries who transported it across the border. Boathouses along the Saskatchewan-North Dakota border, ships on the Great Lakes, trucks running through Vermont and New York. The extent of the family's involvement in actual smuggling, as opposed to merely selling to people who then smuggled it, has been debated by historians for decades. The Bronfmans always maintained that they operated within Canadian law, and technically they did. They sold to anyone who showed up with money. What happened after the sale was, legally speaking, someone else's problem. When American Prohibition ended in 1933, the Bronfmans were ready. Samuel Bronfman had used the Prohibition years to build manufacturing capacity, brand recognition, and distribution networks. He acquired the Seagram Company, an established Canadian distillery, and transformed it into one of the largest spirits companies in the world. By the mid-20th century, Seagram was the largest producer of whiskey globally, and the Bronfman family was one of the wealthiest in Canada. Samuel Bronfman then did exactly what the 1800s dynasties had done. He diversified. He moved into real estate, oil and gas, chemicals, and financial services. He built relationships with political leaders. He became a major philanthropist. He bought respectability. The Bronfman story follows the same pattern as the 1800s families, just in a different era. Find a market with limited competition, often created by government policy. Move aggressively to capture that market. Diversify into finance and other industries. Use wealth to build social connections and political influence. And repeat, the Westons are another family that followed the blueprint with devastating effectiveness. Garfield Weston, born in Toronto in 1898, took over his father's small bakery business and turned it into a global food empire. George Weston Limited, founded by his father George Weston Sr. in 1882, started as a bread delivery route in Toronto. Garfield Weston was a relentless acquirer. He bought bakeries across Canada, then expanded into Britain, buying up biscuit and bread companies during and after World War II, when many British businesses were struggling. His company, Associated British Foods, became one of the largest food companies in the United Kingdom. Back in Canada, the Weston Empire grew through the acquisition of Loblaw companies, which became the cornerstone of the family's Canadian grocery dominance. Over the decades, the Westons bought competitor after competitor, consolidating the Canadian grocery market until they controlled an astonishing share of it. If you shop at Loblaw's, No Frills, Real Canadian Superstore, Shoppers Drug Mart, T&T Supermarket, Provigo, Maxi, or any of a dozen other brands, you're shopping at a Weston-owned business. The Weston family's wealth is currently estimated at over $10 billion. Galen Weston Jr. was, until recently, the chairman of Loblaw Companies and the public face of the empire. The family divides its time between Toronto, London, and various other residences around the world. The Irving family in New Brunswick represents perhaps the most extreme example of regional economic dominance by a single family anywhere in the democratic world. K.C. Irving, Kenneth Colin Irving, was born in 1899 in Bouctouche, New Brunswick. He started with a single gas station and a Ford dealership, and over the next 60 years he built an industrial empire that came to dominate the entire province. Today, the Irving family controls essentially the entire economy of New Brunswick. They own the largest oil refinery in Canada, located in St. John. They own Irving Oil, which operates hundreds of gas stations across Atlantic Canada and the northeastern United States. They own J.D. Irving Limited, one of the largest forestry and lumber companies in North America. They own the province's major newspaper chain, Brunswick News, which means they control virtually all English-language print media in the province. They own shipbuilding facilities that hold major Canadian naval contracts. They own trucking companies, hardware stores, and building supply chains. In many New Brunswick communities, the Irvings are the largest employer, the largest landowner, the largest taxpayer, the media owner, and the primary political donor. The concentration of power is breathtaking, and the fact that one family controls the media that reports on their activities creates a structural accountability gap that is unique in Canada and unusual even by international standards. Nobody in New Brunswick wants to criticize the Irvings on the record, not because they're afraid of physical retaliation, but because the Irvings are the economy. Criticize them, and you might lose your job, your contracts, your advertising revenue, your business relationships. The power doesn't need to be exercised overtly. Its mere existence is sufficient to ensure compliance. The Thompson family built their fortune in media, starting with small-town newspapers in northern Ontario. Roy Thompson bought his first newspaper, the Timmins Daily Press, in 1934. He then expanded into radio, television, and eventually international media and publishing. His son Kenneth Thompson continued the expansion, acquiring major properties, including the Globe and Mail, Canada's national newspaper, and eventually merging the family's information business with Reuters to form Thomson Reuters, one of the largest media and data corporations in the world. The Thompson family's fortune currently exceeds $50 billion, making them one of the wealthiest families in the world, not just Canada. They own significant art collections, including works by major European masters, and their philanthropic activities span multiple countries. Each of these families followed the template established by the Molsons, the Allens, the Stevens, the Eatons, and the Masseys. The specific industries changed. The scale grew, but the fundamental mechanism remained the same. Section 10. The Mythology. Why Canada refuses to see it. There's a reason Canadians don't talk about their oligarchy, and it's not because they're dumb or uninformed. It's because the national mythology is designed to make the question invisible. Every country has a founding myth, a story it tells itself about what makes it special. In the United States, the founding myth is about revolution, individual liberty, and the self-made person. In France, it's about the Republic, liberté, égalité, fraternité. In Australia, it's about the larrikin spirit and the battler. Canada's founding myth is about peace, order, and good government. It's a phrase from the Constitution Act of 1867, and it's more than just words. It's a whole way of thinking about power. In the American story, there's at least the possibility that the rich and powerful are villains. The robber barons, the Rockefellers, the the Carnegies, they're simultaneously admired and criticized. There's a whole cultural tradition of challenging concentrated wealth, from the muckraking journalists of the early 1900s to the antitrust movements of the 20th century. Ida Tarbell's takedown of Standard Oil, Upton Sinclair's exposure of the meatpacking industry, the trust busting of Theodore Roosevelt. Americans have a vocabulary for questioning concentrated economic power, even if they don't always use it effectively. Canada doesn't have that tradition. Not really. The Canadian story is about building, not disrupting. It's about consensus, not conflict. It's about institutions, not individuals. And in a culture that valorizes consensus and institution building, the people who build the institutions are automatically heroes. John Molson built a brewery and a bank. He's a builder. George Stephen built a railroad. He's a nation maker. Timothy Eaton built a department store. He's an innovator. Hart Massey built a concert hall. He's a benefactor. The question of how they built these things, using what resources, extracted from whom, protected by what government policies, at what cost to workers and communities, is simply not part of the story as it's told. This isn't an accident. It's a feature of how cultural narratives work. When a family donates a building to a university, the university is not going to teach courses that critically examine how the family got its money. When a family owns the major newspaper in a province, that newspaper is not going to run investigative series about the family's business practices. When a family funds a political party, that party is not going to pass legislation that threatens the family's interests. The system is self-reinforcing. Wealth buys influence. Influence shapes the narrative. The narrative legitimizes the wealth. And the cycle continues. Let me give you a specific example of how this works. The Eaton family, as we discussed, built their retail empire partly on the backs of poorly paid workers. In the early 1900s, there were several serious labor disputes at Eaton stores and factories. Workers organized, went on strike, and demanded better conditions. These strikes were covered in the press, but they were covered from the perspective of the company, not the workers. Eaton's was presented as a benevolent employer being unreasonably attacked by agitators. The workers' grievances were minimized or ignored. And because the Eaton family had relationships with media owners and political figures, the public narrative was shaped in their favor. Today, Timothy Eaton has a statue in the Toronto Eaton Centre. School children learn about his innovative retail practices. Heritage plaques mark the site of his first store. The labor disputes, the low wages, the anti-union campaigns. They're footnotes if they're mentioned at all. This pattern is repeated across Canadian history. The philanthropic contributions of the wealthy families are celebrated. The mechanisms through which they accumulated their wealth are either ignored or presented as inevitable features of economic development. There's even a linguistic dimension to this. In American English, there's a robust vocabulary for criticizing concentrated wealth. Robber baron, plutocrat, oligarch, monopolist. These terms carry moral judgment. They imply that something is wrong. In Canadian English, the equivalent vocabulary barely exists. The wealthy families are called business leaders, industrialists, entrepreneurs, pioneers. These terms carry no moral judgment. They imply that what happened was natural, inevitable, and probably good. Language shapes thought. If you don't have the words to describe something, you can't think about it clearly. And Canadians, by and large, don't have the words to describe what their country's wealthiest families actually are and how they actually operate. Section 11. The compounding effect. Why 1800s. Wealth is still 2020s. Wealth. Here's a mathematical reality that most people don't think about when they consider old money. Wealth compounds. If a family accumulated the equivalent of 10 million in 1880, and that wealth grew at a conservative average rate of 5% per year, adjusting for inflation, that $10 million would be worth roughly $10 billion today. 5% annual real growth over 145 years turns a large fortune into an incomprehensible one. And 5% is conservative. Many of these families achieve much higher returns because they were invested in industries with monopolistic or near monopolistic positions, where returns are structurally higher than in competitive markets. The Weston family's fortune is estimated at over $10 billion today. The Thompson family's fortune exceeds $50 billion, making them one of the wealthiest families in the world. The Irving family's combined wealth is estimated at over $7 billion. The Bronfman fortune, despite being split among multiple branches of the family, is still measured in the billions. These aren't new fortunes built by new entrepreneurs in new industries. They're old fortunes that have been compounding for over a century, growing larger with each generation, expanding into new industries while maintaining the structural advantages that were established at the beginning. The compounding effect applies not just to money, but to social capital. If your grandfather was a senator, your father probably knew the prime minister. If your father knew the prime minister, you probably went to school with the cabinet minister's children. If you went to school with the cabinet minister's children, your business partner probably sits on a government advisory board. The connections compound just like the money. Each generation inherits not just wealth, but a network of relationships that provides access to information, opportunities, and decision-making processes that are simply unavailable to people outside the network. Consider the Desmarais family. Paul Desmarais Sr. built Power Corporation of Canada into a massive conglomerate spanning financial services, energy, and media. His sons, André and Paul Jr., expanded it further. Paul Desmarais Jr. married France Chrétien, daughter of Prime Minister Jean Chrétien. André Desmarais married a member of another prominent family. The family has close relationships with multiple former prime ministers, cabinet ministers, and senior bureaucrats from both the Liberal and Conservative parties. When Power Corporation or one of its subsidiaries wants something from the government, whether it's a regulatory change, a contract, or simply favorable consideration, they don't need to hire a lobbyist. They can pick up the phone and call the Prime Minister's family. That kind of access isn't available at any price for people outside the network. The tax system also favors the continuation of dynastic wealth. Canada has no estate tax. Let me repeat that. Canada has no estate tax. When a billionaire dies in Canada, their wealth passes to their heirs without being subject to the kind of substantial inheritance tax that exists in many other developed countries. The United States has an estate tax that, at least in theory, can take up to 40% of very large estates. The United Kingdom has an inheritance tax of 40% on estates above a threshold. France, Germany, and Japan all have significant inheritance taxes. Canada abolished its estate tax in 1972. There is a deemed disposition rule that triggers capital gains, tax on death, but there are numerous mechanisms, family trusts, tax planning strategies, and corporate structures that allow wealthy families to minimize the actual tax impact of intergenerational wealth transfer. The result is that wealth created in the 1800s passes from generation to generation with remarkably little erosion. A fortune that would be substantially reduced by inheritance taxes in other countries remains largely intact in Canada. This is not a natural law of economics. It's a policy choice. A choice that, not coincidentally, benefits the families who have the most influence over the policy-making process. Section 12. The Invisible Aristocracy and the Canadian Silence. There's a story that political scientists tell about Canadian political culture. It goes something like this. In the United States, if someone cuts you off in traffic, you honk your horn, and maybe yell something unprintable. In Canada, you apologize for being in their way. It's a joke, obviously, but like most jokes about national character, it captures something real. Canadians have a cultural disposition toward deference, toward consensus, toward avoiding conflict, and this disposition extends to how they relate to their economic elites. When Galen Weston Jr., the chairman of Loblaw Companies, was asked about bread price fixing, a scandal in which multiple major Canadian grocery chains were found to have colluded to artificially inflate the price of bread for over 14 years, the public reaction was remarkably muted. There was no sustained outrage, no mass boycott, no political movement demanding accountability. Loblaw offered customers a $25 gift card as compensation. Millions of Canadians accepted it. The story faded from the news within weeks. Imagine for a moment that the CEO of Walmart had been caught fixing the price of bread in the United States for 14 years. Imagine the congressional hearings, the cable news segments, the class action lawsuits, the political campaigns built around punishing corporate greed. In Canada, it was a $20 gift card and a collective shrug. This isn't because Canadians don't care about being cheated. It's because the cultural framework doesn't provide a clear path for translating that care into action. The mythology of peace, order, and good government includes an implicit assumption that the people running the institutions are doing so in good faith. Challenging that assumption feels, to many Canadians, like challenging the country itself. There's also a geographic dimension to the silence. Canada is enormous, but its population is concentrated in a handful of urban corridors. The people most affected by concentrated economic power are often in rural and remote communities, where the dominant employer is the only employer. If the Irving family is the only significant employer in your town, you don't criticize the Irving family. Not because you don't want to, but because you can't afford to. The same dynamic applies to media. If the only newspaper in your province is owned by the family you might want to criticize, where do you take your story? If the television stations are owned by one of 3 national conglomerates, all of which have business relationships with the family in question, who's going to air your concerns? There have been moments when the system was briefly exposed. The Pacific Scandal of 1873 revealed the naked corruption at the heart of the CPR deal. The Winnipeg General Strike of 1919 challenged the labor practices of the industrial elite. The bread price-fixing scandal of the 2010s briefly made Canadians angry about corporate collusion. But each of these moments passed without producing lasting structural change. The Pacific Scandal led to a temporary change in government, not a change in how government and business interacted. The Winnipeg General Strike was crushed by force, and its leaders were arrested and charged with seditious conspiracy. The bread price-fixing case resulted in relatively minor penalties for the companies involved. The Winnipeg General Strike of 1919 deserves particular attention because it shows what happens when Canadians actually challenge the system. For 6 weeks in May and June of 1919, over 30,000 workers in Winnipeg walked off the job. It was the largest general strike in Canadian history. The workers were demanding collective bargaining rights, better wages, and improved working conditions. They were, in essence, challenging the entire labor structure that had made families like the Eatons and the Flavels wealthy. The response from the establishment was swift and brutal. The Citizens Committee of 1,000, a group of Winnipeg's business elite, organized to oppose the strike. They pressured the government to act. On June 21st, 1919, a day that became known as Bloody Saturday, the Royal Northwest Mounted Police charged into a crowd of strikers on Main Street. They fired shots into the crowd, killing 2 people and injuring dozens. The strike leaders were arrested and charged with seditious conspiracy, and several were convicted and imprisoned. The message was clear. Challenge the economic order, and the full force of the state will be brought to bear against you. The Winnipeg general strike didn't lead to meaningful labor reform. It didn't shift the balance of power between workers and owners. It did, however, demonstrate that the families who controlled the economy also controlled the instruments of state violence. And that demonstration had a chilling effect on Canadian labor activism for decades. The telecommunications industry provides a more contemporary example of the same dynamics at work. Canada's telecom market is dominated by three companies: Bell, Rogers, and TELUS. Together, they control the vast majority of wireless, internet, and television services in the country. Canadians pay some of the highest telecommunications prices in the developed world, and the gap between what Canadians pay and what consumers in comparable countries pay has been documented repeatedly by international studies. The reason for these high prices is the same reason the Molsons dominated brewing and the Redpaths dominated sugar refining. Government policy has historically protected the domestic telecom companies from foreign competition. Foreign ownership restrictions in Canadian telecommunications law prevent international companies from entering the market and competing with the incumbents. These restrictions are justified on grounds of national sovereignty and cultural protection, but their practical effect is to maintain an oligopoly that extracts above-market prices from Canadian consumers. Every month, when you pay your phone bill or your internet bill, you're participating in the same system that John Molson exploited when he sold beer to the military garrison in Montreal. A protected market controlled by a small number of players, generating profits that are higher than they would be in a competitive environment. The mechanism hasn't changed. The technology has. The pattern is consistent. Crisis, brief attention, return to normal. The system absorbs the shock and continues operating. Section 13. The second tier, the families nobody asks about. When you start digging into this history, you realize that the families we've discussed in detail are just the most visible layer of a much deeper system. Below the headline dynasties, there are dozens of families that accumulated significant wealth during the same period using the same mechanisms, and whose descendants continue to wield economic and political influence today. The Richardson family of Winnipeg built their fortune in grain trading during the Western expansion. James Richardson founded his grain business in 1857, and it grew alongside the CPR and the settlement of the prairies. Every bushel of wheat that moved from Prairie Farm to Eastern Port was a business opportunity, and the Richardsons positioned themselves at the center of it. Richardson International remains a major agricultural company today, and the family's wealth is measured in the billions. They also expanded into financial services, with Richardson Securities becoming one of the most important investment firms in Western Canada. The Burkes family built a jewelry empire that became synonymous with luxury in Canada. Henry Burkes opened his first store in Montreal in 1879 and built it into a national chain that was the Canadian equivalent of Tiffany's. For generations, an engagement ring from Burkes was the standard of aspirational middle-class Canadian life. The family name is still on stores across the country. The Rogers family of British Columbia, not the telecommunications Rogers, but the Sugar Rogers. Benjamin Tingley Rogers founded the BC Sugar Refining Company in 1890, establishing a West Coast monopoly on sugar refining that mirrored what the Redpaths had done in the East. The Rogers family became one of the most prominent in Vancouver, and their name is everywhere in the city. The Gooderham family of Toronto built their fortune in distilling. The Gooderham and Worts Distillery, founded in 1832, was at one point the largest distillery in the world. They diversified into banking, with George Gooderham serving as president of the Bank of Toronto. They invested in real estate, including the famous Gooderham Building, the Flatiron Building in Toronto's historic St. Lawrence district. They funded cultural institutions and became pillars of Toronto society. The Flavel family made their fortune in the pork packing industry. Sir Joseph Flavel built the William Davies Company into the largest pork packing operation in the British Empire. The company's products were exported worldwide, and Flavel became one of the wealthiest men in Toronto. During World War I, he chaired the Imperial Munitions Board, which controlled Canada's war production. He was accused of profiteering from the sale of bacon to the British military at inflated prices, earning him the unflattering nickname His Lordship in the press. The scandal briefly tarnished his reputation, but didn't fundamentally alter his power or wealth. The Drummond family of Montreal were bankers and industrialists who embodied the interlocking directorate system. Sir George Drummond was president of the Bank of Montreal, president of the Canada Sugar Refining Company, a competitor to Redpath, and a member of the Canadian Senate. He sat on the boards of numerous companies and was deeply embedded in the Montreal business establishment. His influence extended across banking, manufacturing, and politics simultaneously. Each of these families followed the same pattern. Arrive in Canada during the 1800s, find an industry with limited competition, use government connections and favorable policy to establish a dominant position. Diversify into finance, build social networks with other wealthy families, pass the wealth and connections to the next generation. And repeat, the sheer number of families that fit this pattern is what makes it a system rather than a collection of individual success stories. If one family had managed to dominate an entire industry, you could attribute it to individual talent or luck. When dozens of families all do the same thing, using the same mechanisms, in the same narrow time period, arriving from the same handful of countries, entering the same social networks, attending the same churches, joining the same clubs, marrying into each other's families, and sitting on each other's boards, you're looking at something structural, something designed, even if nobody sat down and drew up the blueprints. Section 14. The people who were already there. We've spent this entire documentary talking about families who arrived in Canada and built fortunes. But Canada wasn't empty when they got there. Indigenous peoples had lived on this land for thousands of years before any European set foot on it. And the wealth that was accumulated by the families we've discussed was, in many cases, directly dependent on the dispossession of indigenous peoples. The 25 million acres of land granted to the CPR came from territory that had been indigenous homeland for millennia. The agricultural expansion that made the Massey fortune possible was only possible because indigenous peoples had been pushed onto reserves through treaties that were often negotiated under duress, misrepresented by government negotiators, or simply violated by the Crown after signing. The timber that built fortunes for logging families came from forests that indigenous peoples had managed and inhabited for generations beyond counting. The reserve system itself was an economic mechanism, not just a social one. By confining indigenous peoples to small, often unproductive parcels of land, the government freed up the rest of the territory for exploitation by settlers and the companies that served them. The Indian Act of 1876 restricted indigenous peoples' ability to engage in commercial activity, to hire lawyers, to organize politically, and to leave their reserves without permission from a government agent. It effectively locked them out of the economic system that was being built on their former lands. The pass system, implemented informally on the prairies after the Northwest Resistance of 1885, required indigenous people to obtain a written pass from their Indian agent before leaving their reserve. This system had no legal basis in the Indian Act or any other legislation, but it was enforced for decades. It prevented indigenous people from selling their agricultural products at market, from seeking employment, and from building the kind of economic relationships that the settler families used to build their fortunes. At the same time that George Stephen was receiving 25 million acres of indigenous land as a gift from the government, indigenous farmers on prairie reserves were being prohibited from selling their grain commercially. The government's stated policy was to prevent indigenous farmers from competing with settler farmers. Let that reality settle in for a moment. The same government that was giving millions of acres of free land to a private railroad company was preventing the original inhabitants of that land from participating in the economy at all. This isn't tangential to the story of Canada's wealthy families. It's central to it. The wealth was built on land that was taken. The labor market that drove the industrial economy was fueled by immigration that was only possible because land was available, and land was only available because it had been taken from its original inhabitants. Every acre of CPR land, every farm that bought Massey equipment, every ton of sugar refined by Redpath from Caribbean cane, every shipload of immigrants carried by Allen's ships to settle on the prairies, all of it was connected to a system of colonial dispossession that transferred resources from indigenous peoples to European settlers and the families that profited from settling them. Today, indigenous communities in Canada have the highest poverty rates, the worst health outcomes, the lowest educational attainment, and the most inadequate housing of any demographic group in the country. The gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians on virtually every measure of well-being is enormous and persistent, and that gap is not a coincidence. It's a direct consequence of the same system that created the family fortunes we've been discussing. The wealth went somewhere, and it came from somewhere. Following the money in both directions tells you the complete story. The residential school system, which operated from the 1880s to the 1990s, was part of this same economic architecture. Over 150,000 Indigenous children were removed from their families and placed in institutions designed to eliminate their languages, cultures, and identities. The system was funded by the federal government and operated primarily by churches, but its economic function was clear. It severed the connection between Indigenous peoples and their lands, their economies, and their communities. It produced generations of people who were traumatized, disconnected from traditional knowledge, and ill-equipped to navigate the settler economy that had replaced their own. While those children were being taken from their families, the families we've been discussing were building concert halls with their names on them, endowing university chairs, and being celebrated as the builders of a great nation. The land that the CPR sold to settlers, the land that Massey's machines plowed, the land that produced the grain that Richardson traded, the land that generated the real estate wealth that fills the portfolios of the elite to this day, all of it was Indigenous land. That's not a moral interpretation. It's a statement of historical fact, and the dispossession didn't end in the 1800s. Modern land claims by Indigenous nations cover vast portions of Canada, including some of the most economically valuable territory in the country. These claims are based on the recognition that the treaties that transferred the land were either never signed, were signed under duress, were misrepresented by government negotiators, or were violated by the Crown. The resolution of these claims, when it happens at all, is painfully slow and chronically underfunded. Meanwhile, the families whose wealth was built on that same land continue to prosper. The contradiction between Canada's stated commitment to reconciliation and the ongoing economic structures that benefit from historical dispossession is one of the most fundamental tensions in Canadian society, and it's a tension that can only be understood by tracing the money back to its origins in the 1800s. Section 15. The Architecture of Inequality. Let's come back to where we started. A handful of families who showed up in Canada between 1780 and 1880, most of them from Scotland, England, or Ireland, with modest resources, who within a single generation became the permanent owners of an entire country's economic infrastructure. They didn't do it through genius, though some of them were genuinely smart. They didn't do it through pure hard work, though many of them worked extraordinarily hard. They did it through a system of government, granted monopolies, protected markets, land grants, tariff policies, and insider networks that channeled public resources into private hands and then locked those resources in place across generations. The brewery, the bank, the shipping line, the railroad, the department store, the farm equipment factory, the sugar refinery. Each of these enterprises was, in its way, a piece of critical national infrastructure, and each of them was controlled by a private family that had received its position, not through market competition, but through political connection. The wealth from these enterprises didn't stay in those industries. It flowed into finance, where it was used to control the allocation of capital across the entire economy. It flowed into real estate, where it captured the rising value of land in growing cities. It flowed into new industries, from oil to telecommunications to food retail, where the pattern of monopolistic concentration was repeated. And at every stage, the families used their wealth to shape the political, cultural, and media environments in ways that protected and legitimized their position. Philanthropic donations bought cultural goodwill. Media ownership controlled the narrative. Political donations ensured favorable policy. Social networks maintained the exclusivity of the elite. The result is a country that looks democratic, but operates, in many important respects, as a soft oligarchy. Canadians vote in free elections, but the range of policy options available to them is constrained by the economic power of families whose interests must be accommodated. Canadians have a free press, but that press is largely owned by the same families whose activities it is supposed to scrutinize. Canadians have a market economy, but that market is dominated by a small number of very large firms, controlled by a small number of very wealthy families. None of this means that Canada is a terrible country. By virtually any measure of human well-being, Canada is one of the best places in the world to live. The healthcare system, the educational system, the social safety net, the rule of law, all of these are real and valuable. But the benefits of Canadian society are distributed unevenly, and the unevenness has a pattern that traces directly back to the families who arrived in the 1800s and captured the country's economic infrastructure before anyone else had a chance. The median Canadian family has seen their real income stagnate over the past 30 years, while the wealth of the top 1% has grown dramatically. Housing affordability has deteriorated to crisis levels in many Canadian cities, partly because land ownership is concentrated among a relatively small number of entities, including several of the families we've discussed. The cost of groceries has risen sharply in a market dominated by a handful of companies, controlled by a handful of families. The housing crisis is worth examining specifically because it connects directly to the 1800s land accumulation patterns. The CPR received 25 million acres of land. The Hudson's Bay Company retained significant land holdings after the Rupert's land transfer. Individual families accumulated real estate portfolios in growing cities like Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver. Over the generations, these land holdings have appreciated enormously, making their owners fabulously wealthy while making housing increasingly unaffordable for ordinary Canadians. In Vancouver, the story of urban land concentration is particularly stark. The city's real estate market is among the most expensive in the world, with average home prices regularly exceeding $1 million. A significant portion of the city's developable land is owned by a relatively small number of families and corporations whose land holdings date back to the late 1800s. The Canadian Pacific Railway's land grants in British Columbia included parcels in what is now prime Vancouver real estate. Those grants, given away by the government 140 years ago, are today worth billions of dollars. The same pattern holds in Toronto. The downtown core is dominated by a handful of major landlords, several of whom trace their real estate holdings back to the 1800s or early 1900s. The Cadillac Fairview Corporation, owned by the Ontario Teachers' Pension Plan, and Brookfield Asset Management, connected to the Bronfman family through historical ownership structures, control vast swaths of commercial real estate. Every office worker paying rent in a downtown Toronto tower is, in some indirect but real way, paying tribute to the families who accumulated these properties generations ago. The connection between the 1800s land grabs and the 2020s housing crisis is not metaphorical. It is direct and traceable. Land that was given away by the government to incentivize railroad construction, or accumulated by merchants who used government contracts to build their initial capital, has passed through generations of ownership, appreciating in value at every stage, until it has become so expensive that ordinary Canadians can no longer afford to live in the cities that were built on it. When young Canadians are told that they can't afford a home because of immigration or interest rates or foreign buyers, they're being given partial explanations that obscure the deeper structural reality. The fundamental reason housing is so expensive is that land ownership is concentrated, and it has been concentrated since the 1800s. Everything else is secondary. These are not abstract economic trends. They are the direct consequences of a power structure that was established over a century ago and has been compounding ever since. Section 16, the grocery aisle, where the oligarchy meets your dinner table. If all of this history feels abstract, let me make it concrete. Walk into any grocery store in Canada, look at the prices on the shelf, then ask yourself a simple question. Why does everything cost so much? The answer involves the same families we've been discussing. The Canadian grocery market is controlled by three companies: Loblaw Companies, owned by the Weston family; Sobeys Inc., owned by the Sobe family of Nova Scotia; and Metro Inc. Together, these three companies control roughly 60 to 65% of all grocery sales in Canada. In many communities, particularly outside major urban centers, the effective market share is even higher because there are simply no other options. This level of concentration is unusual among developed economies. In the United States, the top three grocery chains control roughly 35% of the market. In the United Kingdom, it's about 55%, but spread among more competitors. In Germany, the market is divided among a larger number of significant players. Canada's grocery market is an outlier, and the prices reflect it. The bread price fixing scandal, which we mentioned earlier, is the most vivid illustration of what happens when a market is this concentrated. Between 2001 and 2015, Loblaw, Sobeys, and other major bakeries coordinated to raise the price of bread by approximately 10 to 15 cents per loaf over a 14-year period. It was a textbook example of price fixing, and it affected virtually every Canadian who bought bread during that period. When the scandal was revealed, Loblaw offered customers a $25 gift card, which was redeemable only at Loblaw-owned stores. Think about the audacity of that for a second. A company that overcharged you for bread for 14 years offered you a gift card that you could only spend at their stores, ensuring that even the compensation had generated revenue for the company. The total value of the bread price fixing to the companies involved has been estimated at hundreds of millions of dollars. The 25 gift cards cost Loblaw a fraction of that. The company actually reported that the gift card program increased store traffic and spending. They turned a scandal into a promotion. But bread is just one product. The structural issue is much bigger. When three companies control the majority of a country's food distribution, they have the ability to influence prices across thousands of products. They have leverage over suppliers, farmers, and food manufacturers that allows them to squeeze costs at every level of the supply chain while maintaining or increasing their own margins. Canadian grocery margins have been trending upward for years, even as the companies claim that rising costs are forcing them to raise prices. The parliamentary committee hearings on grocery prices in 2023 revealed that the major chains were increasing their margins, even as food inflation was causing real hardship for Canadian families. Galen Weston Jr. testified before the committee and denied that Loblaw was engaged in profiteering. The exchange was polite, respectful, and utterly toothless. No meaningful policy changes resulted. The prices stayed high. The profits kept flowing. And here's the connection to the 1800s that most people miss. The Weston family's dominance of Canadian grocery retail didn't happen through market competition in the way that economists would define it. It happened through decades of acquisitions, many of which would have been blocked in countries with stronger antitrust enforcement. Loblaw bought Shoppers Drug Mart in 2013 for $12.4 billion, adding thousands of retail locations to its empire. It bought T&T Supermarket. It bought Provigo. It bought National Grocers. Each acquisition reduced competition. Each reduction in competition gave the remaining players more pricing power. And the more pricing power they had, the more money they made, which they used to fund more acquisitions. The cycle is identical to what the 1800s families did, just applied to groceries instead of railroads. The Sobey family followed a similar playbook. Frank Sobey started with a single store in Stellarton, Nova Scotia, in 1907. Over a century of acquisitions, the family built Sobeys Inc. into the second largest grocery chain in Canada. They acquired Safeway Canada's operations in 2013, adding hundreds of stores in Western Canada. The family controls Sobeys through Empire Company Limited, which also has interests in real estate and other sectors. The parallel to the 1800s is exact. Find an essential industry. Eliminate competition through acquisition. Use the resulting market power to extract above-market returns. Diversify into other sectors. Pass the wealth and the business to the next generation. The only difference is that in the 1800s, the essential industries were railroads and banks. Today, it's the grocery stores and the telecommunications companies and the insurance firms. The mechanism is the same. The families are sometimes the same, sometimes new. But the pattern hasn't changed in over 150 years. Section 17. The question. Nobody asks. We've covered a lot of ground. 2 centuries of history, dozens of families, billions of dollars, and a political and economic system that has remained remarkably stable despite democratic elections, social movements, and dramatic economic changes. So let's end where we began, with the question, why doesn't anybody question it? The answer, I think, is that the question itself feels un-Canadian. To ask how these families got their wealth, to scrutinize the mechanisms of power, to challenge the narrative of nation-building and entrepreneurial merit feels like attacking the country, because the families and the country are so intertwined in the national mythology that criticizing one feels like criticizing the other. The Molson name is on the beer and the hockey arena. The Eaton name was on the department store and the shopping center. The Massey name is on the concert hall and the university building. The Redpath name is on the sugar and the museum. These aren't just business names. They're landmarks. They're pieces of the national identity. Questioning how the Molsons got their money feels like questioning hockey. Questioning the Eatons feels like questioning Christmas shopping. Questioning the CPR syndicate feels like questioning Confederation itself. And that's exactly how it's designed to work. When wealth becomes sufficiently embedded in the culture, questioning it becomes culturally unacceptable. The wealth doesn't just buy goods and services, it buys immunity from scrutiny. But here's the thing. asking questions isn't the same as tearing things down. Understanding how power works isn't the same as wanting to destroy power. You can appreciate what the CPR meant for national unity while also acknowledging that the terms of the deal were extraordinarily favorable to private interests. You can shop at Loblaws while recognizing that the Weston family's market dominance limits competition and raises prices. You can enjoy a Molson Canadian while knowing that the Molson fortune was built on government contracts and banking monopolies. The point isn't to be angry. The point is to be informed, because the system that was built in the 1800s is still operating. The families that captured the economy 150 years ago are still, in many cases, the families that control it today. And the mechanisms that allowed them to do it, the government favoritism, the monopolistic market structures, the political connections, the media ownership, the tax advantages, are still in place. Whether that's acceptable is a question every Canadian has to answer for themselves, but they can't answer it honestly if they don't know the history. And until now, most of them didn't. There's a concept in political science called structural power. It's different from the kind of power that involves giving orders or threatening punishment. Structural power is the power to shape the environment in which decisions are made. You don't have to tell politicians what to do if the economic system is structured so that politicians naturally serve your interests. You don't have to censor journalists if the media ownership system ensures that certain stories never get investigated. You don't have to rig elections if the policy options available to voters are all compatible with your interests. The families that built their fortunes in the 1800s didn't just accumulate money. They accumulated structural power. They shaped the institutions, the laws, the norms, and the narratives that determine how Canada functions. And because structural power is invisible by design, most Canadians don't even know it exists. When you drive on a highway that was built along a CPR right-of-way, you're moving through the physical infrastructure of the oligarchy. When you deposit your paycheck in one of the big five banks, you're participating in a financial system designed by and for the families that founded those banks. When you buy groceries at one of three chains that dominate the market, you're paying prices set by a competitive structure those families created through decades of acquisitions. When you read a newspaper or watch a news broadcast, you're consuming information filtered through media, organizations owned or influenced by the same network. It's not a conspiracy. It's just how the country was built. And because it's how the country was built, most Canadians can't see it any more than a fish can see water. The question isn't whether you should be angry about it. Anger is understandable, but not particularly useful on its own. The question is whether you're willing to see it, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. And once enough people see it, things can actually start to change. Canada is not unique in having an oligarchy. Every developed country has concentrations of wealth and power. What makes Canada unusual is the degree to which its oligarchy is invisible, unquestioned, and culturally protected. In other countries, people at least argue about it. In Canada, the argument hasn't really started yet. Maybe it's time it did. Think about everything we've covered. A brewery owner who became a banker, who became a steamship operator. A teenage clerk who became the richest man in the country through government mail contracts. A railroad syndicate that received land grants larger than European nations. A department store founder whose innovations were made possible by a captive market and exploited labor. A farm equipment manufacturer who achieved monopoly status and then used that monopoly to keep farmers in perpetual debt. A sugar refiner who built a fortune on tariff protections and Caribbean plantation economics. A whiskey family that exploited the gap between Canadian and American prohibition laws. A grocery dynasty that fixed the price of bread for 14 years and compensated customers with gift cards, redeemable only at their own stores. Each story, taken individually, is remarkable. Taken together, they reveal something much bigger. They reveal a system that was designed, whether intentionally or through the accumulated weight of individual decisions, to concentrate wealth in the hands of a few and keep it there indefinitely. The system wasn't built by evil people. Most of the family founders were, by the standards of their time, ordinary men who saw opportunities and seized them. The problem isn't with any individual family or any individual decision. The problem is with the structure itself, a structure that rewards first movers with permanent advantages, that turns temporary monopolies into permanent dynasties, that converts economic power into political influence, and political influence back into economic power in an endless, self-reinforcing cycle. And the deepest problem of all is that Canadians have been taught not to see it, taught to celebrate the builders without examining the building process, taught to honor the philanthropists without questioning the source of the philanthropy, taught to accept concentrated economic power as a natural feature of the landscape, like the Rocky Mountains or the Northern Lights, rather than as a human creation that could be organized differently. A handful of families showed up in Canada in the 1800s. They came from Scotland, England, Ireland, and eventually Eastern Europe. They arrived with modest resources but extraordinary timing. They walked into an economy with no competition, a government that was handing out monopolies, and a population that was too small and too dispersed to push back. Within a single generation, they owned the banks, the railroads, the shipping lines, the department stores, the factories, and the refineries. Within 2 generations, they owned the newspapers. Within 3 generations, they owned the grocery chains, the oil companies, and the telecommunications firms. Today, their descendants control more of the Canadian economy than ever before. Their names are on buildings, arenas, universities, and hospitals. Their foundations fund cultural institutions. Their representatives sit on government advisory boards. Their families marry into other wealthy families, and the cycle continues. They appeared from nowhere, and nobody questions it until you.